Hi there, my name's Taylor Coyne. I'm a PhD student at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. I'm within the Environment and Society Research Group. I wanted today to present to you some work that I've been doing in the Georges River catchment area. The research is titled, for today, this webinar, Water Sensitive Urban Design Waterscape with Community Culture at its Heart. I wanted to reiterate the phrase "at its heart" a little bit more, because for UNSW, where I am, we have recently changed our motto and subsequent logo, which you can see here. So whereas it used to read "Scientia Manu et Mante," which meant knowledge with hand and mind, it now reads "Scientia Corde Manu et Mante," which means knowledge with heart, hand, and mind. So this kind of inclusion of corde as heart here is something that I feel quite passionate about, because to me, and it kind of speaks to the whole point of this webinar, is that the need for compassion and consideration of culture and societies is fundamental, and whether that be from an academic education point of view or research point of view, or as a practice in stormwater management or water management in general. I think we can all take that as a guide to think more with our hearts in our day-to-day practice. So a bit about me. I really like stormwater infrastructure. I really love waters. I love rivers and creeks and swamps and wetlands. But in recent years, I've become really quite taken with all of these types of stormwater infrastructures that pop up, or at least I see pop up all around Sydney, where I live. I live on Bejugal country, and I would like to acknowledge that all of these photos are taken on lands and waters of the Eora Nation. So these are all in Sydney on Eora land and waters. The way I attack, or at least try to understand, these stormwater infrastructures is through the lenses that I have developed over the last decade or so of learning at universities, which is centered around human geography, and in particular environmental history and political ecology. I also have looked more into urban design as as a discipline as well in recent years as well. Why the background now? So why am I showing you this research today? So the research that is being presented to you today comes from a collaboration that occurred between the Georges Riverkeeper and University of New South Wales, Sydney. A core agenda within the Georges Riverkeeper strategic plan is this idea of the research program, which has been put forward. And this research program is really great because it not only enables the Georges Riverkeeper to get world-class researchers to do research, but it also enables students and researchers from UNSW to apply their knowledge to real-world issues. So this connection or this linkage is really, really important and kind of advances both of our institutions, I believe. The collaborations that took place to enable the research really were quite interdisciplinary. So there has been some folks working more so in the hard sciences within engineering as well, and me in the social sciences, in the humanities background. The collaborations and the potential to continue this research in the future is still ongoing. There are students, we would love to see more and more of this kind of collaboration happen in the future as well. The main research question that was being asked out of the collaboration that was targeted to my area, which was, what are the community perceptions of water infrastructure in the Georges River catchment? There's two very large, quite sweeping concepts in there. The first is the Georges River catchment, which is obviously quite a large catchment. And so to try and pinpoint a particular community within that is quite challenging. And of that, obviously, also recognizing the second kind of sweeping claim, which is the community perceptions. That, first of all, it's very, as I mentioned, difficult to pinpoint a particular community, and then to articulate that entire community's perceptions of something as broad as water infrastructure is quite a challenge as well. So in order to try and combat that challenge, I kind of tweaked the question a little bit to reflect those nuances, which is this new question here: how can water infrastructures better reflect community values whilst providing sustainable and safe futures? The question kind of led me to go to Lugano, fundamentally, to the Georges River. So I kind of gave it away where I went already. But so I took myself down to the Georges River and had a bit of a wander around. I myself am not a Georges River local. I grew up in the Blue Mountains. So for me, coming at it with some fresh eyes was quite exciting to see these places that I'd never seen before, and to try and get a bit of an understanding of what I'm looking at here. And what I was looking at was this concept that had kind of popped up every now and a few times, which is shadow infrastructures. So these are the infrastructures that we engage with on a day-to-day level in ways that might not seem so explicit straight away. So whereas you might engage with something like a road or a train, train line, those are kinds of the explicit infrastructures that are made kind of tangible, in a day-to-day setting. The shadow infrastructures are those things like the stormwater infrastructures that function absolutely and contribute to the correct functioning of our day-to-day lives, but they exist in the shadows, so to speak. And I kind of was curious as to why, because I care a lot about stormwater infrastructures, and so I wonder if other people maybe care about them as well, or if they've even noticed them, or what do they consider as a stormwater infrastructure. Yes, there's a drain or this various pumping stations or what have you, but there are other ways of thinking about stormwater infrastructures as well, which I wanted to kind of see if other people were thinking like that as well. So in order to do that, as I said, I took myself to Lugano, which is where I kind of settled on as a spot for a number of reasons. So I'll come back to that in a moment. The main reason is that it was obviously, as you can see here, quite a central location that is literally sticks out into the Georges River. So the Georges River being the Blue River that comes in from Botany Bay and kind of weaves its way westwards and then up and then back down again as well. So HV Everett Memorial Park was chosen because it has three main criteria that I was using for my research. The first being that it had a high proximity, high proportion of people, a high amount of people present. As a human geographer, I do need humans to be there. So I was interested in somewhere that had a lot of people, a lot of foot traffic, because I was anticipating to do surveys and behavioural mapping, which were two of the methods that I'll touch on in a moment. But these surveys needed to get a large volume of people moving through, and so the regular sport events that occurred at the park made this a great spot for me to do research. The other criteria was that it would ideally have a water feature like this. So present in the park is a dam called Webb's Dam, and this dam, as an actual fact, as the sign kind of illuminates here and as the pipe might suggest, it's actually a stormwater fed dam. And so this dam feature acts as a kind of a biofiltration or a retention system. The water would kind of collect and then seep down into the groundwater, and in some instances also trickle down into the Georges River, which was the third criteria, that the place for the research would be close to the river. So this is only a few hundred meters away from the park, and that's the Georges River there that we can look out to. So between those three criteria, I kind of decided on HV Everett Memorial Park there as where I would do the research. Onto the methodologies. So now I had my place to do the research. I was going to try and do the research. So how was I going to do that? Well, as I mentioned, as an environmental historian, I would look through the archives. So doing archival analysis and looking through particular archives that were relevant to the Georges River, So whether that be, various local libraries and history groups, or, state libraries, or even the National Archives with Trove. So those were kind of the archives that I was looking at to draw on for the research. The second was this concept called a method called behavioral mapping, whereby I stand in one place and I observe what's going on in that place, and literally note down where people are going and how long they're spending in those places. The third method was the surveys. Quite straightforward. It was just me with a clipboard going off and surveying some folks down in the park. Quite old school, very pre-COVID, obviously, but successful nonetheless. The immediate results that I got from the research could be kind of divided into two parts. The first, which is kind of heavily comes out of the archival analysis, is the histories of the river, or what might be thought of as biographies of the river. The second kind of result that emerged was the community perceptions and values. Where those interacted, where that interface in the middle there, that's really what I'm going to try and be talking to you today a little bit about. And to me, that's very fundamentally at the core of the entire research, is how do these two areas overlap. So what emerged as a kind of a result from that interface, that middle ground, was a story about what was going on with the Georges River in Lugano in particular, that weaved through space and time. So within, out of the research, the results, we came up with a collection of phases. Now these phases might be thought of as less so as like a distinct temporal delineation. So, I'm not talking about between 1860 and 1901, but rather these are more fluid, if we can think of it in that sense. And the other thing is that, importantly, these phases don't exist necessarily in the progression that I outline here for you, but I'll touch on that in a moment as well. So the first phase that I identified is phase 0, and this is the deep history river. So we can also think of it as a deep time as well. So I use phase 0 in this sense very explicitly to kind of denote its foundational aspects, so that it exists not as phase 1, but as the phase before phase 1, the kind of the always phase, if you would. Phase 1 itself is identified as the seclusion river, and I'll touch on and expand on these in a moment as well. Phase 2 is the development river. Phase 3 is the menacing river. Phase 4 is the recreation river, and phase 5 is what we are calling the democratic river. Now, as we can see here, as I mentioned, it is outlined as a progression, but I'd rather us think about these phases, or these stages, or these, if you will, almost these vibes of the river in this sense as well. So rather than it being as a delineated progression, they actually can exist, and in many instances very much do exist concurrently. That the river can exist both as a recreation river and a menacing river, that it can exist as a deep history river always, and also have development occurring at the same time. This mosaic is something that I really want us to try and think more of than the alternative, which is that linear progression. So the deep history river here is reminiscent of a deep time. So a deep time or deep history reflects not so much on like a historic or a prehistoric time period, but more so as what's referenced as a deep history. So this might be thought of as a geological history as well. So here we're talking not hundreds of thousands, but millions and billions of years in this instance. So if you look at this geological map of Sydney here, from the Geological Survey of New South Wales, we can see an area circled in red, this bit down here. So the yellows are the kind of the alluvial sands layer of the geological map, but where you see a red, so we can see we can see a few bits of red. The first one is the one encircled there at Lugano, and then further up at Prospect as well, near the Prospect Reservoir. What the red indicates is a volcanic intrusion. So this is an area where the sandstone has been, where a volcanic intrusion has broken through the sandstone. And this was noted in 1929 in the Department of Mines survey, where they say the neck, this is the neck at Lugano, occupies a conspicuous depression within the Hawkesbury Sandstone. In the deepest portion of the valley, the surface of the neck is from 75 to 160 feet below the ridgetop and about 100 feet above the level of the Georges River. What's also important to recognise with the Deep History River is that it reflects time in a Western sense, whereas understandings of time in other cultures, such as in Indigenous cultures, don't necessarily reflect this kind of this linear trajectory in any sense at all. So there's concepts such as always time that kind of speak to time and to history and to understandings of history, not as something that was necessarily so much in the past, but something that kind of exists in the present and in the future. And in many instances, these occur as a cycle. And so in this instance, I reflect on how Deep History River can represent Indigenous knowledges of the river and the area at the same time in that sense. So moving on from the Deep History River explanation, how is the river thought of as a seclusion river? So from here, seclusion river can be thought of as starting or at least coming to the fore during early British occupation in the Sydney region. So this map from James Cook in 1770 shows how the areas around Sydney were starting to be understood, to be mapped, literally in this sense. So we can see Botany Bay here in the centre, and moving northwards is up to the Cooks River, and then very much kind of coming down to the south, to the west, southwest rather, is the Georges River there. So you can actually almost identify Tower Point there by the shape of that headland in the middle there. But the Georges River is very clearly kind of identified, not so much in a name, but at least in its shape and direction, that it is started to be identified. But as we can clearly see here, Cook didn't really go very far up the river. Someone who did go a little bit further up the river was Arthur Phillip. So this is from David Collins's book, Account of the English Colony of New South Wales, from its first settlement in January 1788 to 1801. So here he accounts Governor Phillip's journey up the Georges River, which I'll read here for you. On the 19th of the month, the Governor Phillip, went on an excursion to Botany Bay in order to explore Georges River as far up as was practicable, and to examine the soil on its banks, which he found to be of good quality and considerable extent. This river, which was observed to run in a westerly direction about 25 miles up from Botany Bay, was, in many parts of its branches, exceedingly picturesque, and navigable for small craft, for at least 20 miles up. Some of its creeks or branches reached within a small distance of Prospect Hill. Between this river and Parramatta, the Governor, on his return, travelled through a thick bushy wood covering an excellent soil. So obviously soil is coming up as something that's quite important to the early folk who were moving around this space, and this kind of reflects the deepness to which they would send their reconnaissance missions into the heart of the Georges River area. So here we can see this map that shows from an east to west projection. So the Pacific Ocean, Tasman Sea is kind of at the bottom of the map there, and then you can see Botany Bay in there. So the Cooks River is moving off to the right-hand side of the map, and then the Georges River is moving up towards the top of the illustration there for you. And here we can see again, this is not that much time. It's a progression of how the Georges River was significant to early kind of settlement in that area. But the kind of the distance that was being covered to be sought after for various reasons is reflected in that idea of seclusion, in that people, in particular free settlers, wanting to try and escape what might be thought of as the chaos of Sydney town at the time, were looking to create a new life for themselves, but fundamentally a new life for themselves that was on someone else's land, Indigenous land. So recognising that the free settlers were putting themselves into a place that was already occupied by Aboriginal people is something that I'm very, very attentive to in this sense. But it nonetheless encapsulates this concept of a seclusion river. As we can see in the illustration here, there are no people. It is just the singular man with his hat by his hut on the banks of the river. as we move forward away from the seclusion river, we can start to think of the uses of the river, the functionality of the river. How has it been practically developed, and how might it be exploited even in the same sense. So images like this, which show plans for subdivision around Lugano in particular, we can see here, speak to the expansion of residential development in the area, and kind of how the area has been shifted in its uses. And one of the main points that I wanted to raise, which is very, very significant for H.V. Everett Memorial Park, is these areas circled in red. So these areas are the park, what is now the park, but was once Webb's garden. So there was a man, Webb, he had a garden, an orchard garden there, and he would sell these vegetables and fruits to the markets in the city. So the presence of this garden speaks back to the deep history, the deep time of the area. That this garden exists where it does is a factor of the volcanic intrusion. So because of the volcanic intrusion, it meant there was incredibly fertile soils, and those fertile soils were conducive to good growing of fruits and vegetables, which in the area, which is a very heavily sandstone kind of sandy soil area, was really quite desirable. And because of that, the legacy of the volcanic intrusion and the garden, it meant that the area was kind of always designated as somewhere that was not necessarily should be developed for residential development. And we can see how kind of this would appear in various discourses around this space. So from a newspaper, The Farmer and Settler, in 1951, grows vegetables in an old crater near the city. So this is speaking of Mr. E. Webb here in Lugano Parade. And we can see various illustrations of how significant this was, and to the point where the dam where the park, the dam in the park is now called Webb's Dam in reflection of Mr. E. Webb in that sense. The other way of thinking about the development river stage is to think about how water and water infrastructures and stormwater infrastructures were being developed at the same time as kind of Lugano was facing development in a residential sense as well. So shifting ideas of hydrology and thinking about stormwater drainage and thinking about catchments as well, so thinking at the catchment level, was starting to become very much a part of water management at that time that Sydney was starting to develop. This then kind of can lead into a new way of thinking about the river. That is that as much as development is occurring, there's also threats that are appearing at the same time. So from 1941, from the Liverpool News, this article here speaks of the pollution of the Georges River. So they say, in connection with the pollution of the Georges River, the General Purposes Committee reported to Liverpool Council an inspection that had been made of the area, and also the wastewaters entering the Georges River from factories and military drains. There's already a recognition, even in 1941, that localised pollution was becoming an issue for the river, and this kind of would continue on for decades to come. Other forms of menace can be seen in various guises, such as the floods that would occur. So the flooding in 1950 was quite disastrous. So over 150 homes were menaced, as it says here, by the rising river. So I'm thinking here about how the river is being portrayed. What is the narrative that's being put forward about the river in places like the Sydney Morning Herald? And what impact might that have on how people who live in the area think about the river? Another way of thinking about the river as a menace is to think about engagements with the more than human, the animals and creatures who live in the river. And so instances like shark attacks also kind of speak to how the river might be thought of something to be feared or to be cautious of in a way. And so out of these ideas of the menacing river emerge a new way of thinking about the river. And here I'm not saying, and I want to make it clear that it particularly stopped at a particular point in time, but as kind of has been showed up, these are not a linear trajectory of events, but rather ways of thinking about the river. So after after thinking about the river in a menacing sense, another way of thinking about the river might be that it's actually very positive, that there is a recreational aspect to the river. And so this came largely in around about the 50s and 60s and into the 70s all the way through to now. And even before, I would argue as well that, depending on who you spoke to or depending on the sources you've read, the way that the river could be thought of could have been recreational. And indeed, there were instances of early recreation occurring on the river. But where in Lugano and in HVF Memorial Park this shift occurred was around about 1965 when the garden became the park. So this wasn't a completely kind of smooth pathway. It actually happened with a little bit of protest and tension, and there was in fact a bulldozer placed right out the front of the park as kind of a point of I'm not sure what, but you can kind of imply that if there's a bulldozer out the front of a park, there's anticipated development would happen. After a kind of a local election in 1965, the bulldozer was removed and the park was kind of made the park, which is now HV Everett Memorial Park. The engagement with the river at a recreational sense, as I said, still comes through today. So this is from the Georges Riverkeeper website, where there's a section on how to enjoy the river. So things to do along the Georges River. There's either walking and cycling, swimming, fishing, and boating and watercraft. And if anyone who goes down to the Georges River knows, there is a lot of boats there, especially on a nice sunny Saturday in summer. But thinking about the recreation river as a way to start moving people more into the picture, into the discussion. How are communities engaging with the river? And so in this sense, we move into the democratic river. So this is a progression and an advancement from recreation river to thinking about true fundamental participation in how the river is managed. And at its core, the democratic river phase speaks not so much just to how various communities and peoples and neighborhoods have a say in how the river is managed, but also, as we note in the paper that I'll come to later, I argue about this concept of legal personhood, so kind of attributing agency to the river itself as a democratic participant in its management and in its futures. So in this sense, I draw on literature around legal personhoods of rivers. So these are some clippings from some newspapers that kind of speak to just how much of a global movement is occurring around the world right now about legal personhood for rivers. So whether that be, in Quebec, in India, or, in New Zealand with the Whanganui River, there are more and more rivers that are being attributed legal personhoods. And this is a very real conversation for river managers who are thinking about how can we think about how the river will be managed in the future. And legal personhood is something that needs to be paid attention to because it is growing in momentum, even in Australia. So the Yarra River in Victoria is starting to is shifting towards, whilst it's not happening as fast and as energetically in other countries as it is in Australia, but it is at least happening in smatterings as well. So I have these two images here to show you kind of side by side in that attributing legal personhood to rivers requires the same way that attributing, a child has legal rights, but that child has to have legal representation, someone to speak on behalf of that child as they can't speak for themselves in many instances. So we could also think about kind of animal rights in this instance as well. Who speaks on behalf of that question is who speaks on behalf of is something that comes forward here in that in many instances, like the Whanganui River in New Zealand, it is Indigenous people who speak on behalf of the river. So here this links into the CRC Water Sensitive Cities idea of connection to country and Aboriginal values. So fundamentally, I feel that attributing legal personhood to rivers can connect to thinking about how Australian water sensitive cities can actually work towards achieving that goal. And this fits in with ideas of water sensitive urban design in quite a unique way in that the convention at the moment is this nested egg kind of model that we might have an on-site development, that's very much focused on the built environment, which is a water sensitive urban development. Kind of moving out of that, we have WSUDs, or water sensitive urban design, that's at more local scale, so thinking about neighbourhoods and communities. How can we integrate water sensitive urban design into our built environment at a street level, at a park level? And these are all great. And then we come to what has been put forward as quite an innovative way of thinking about water management, which is integrated water cycle management. Which is, once again, it's thinking at a bigger scale. So this is, catchment and regional scales, and with a longer temporal framing around it. And these are all great. I'm not saying that they're not good, but what I'm saying is that at almost every stage of this, I'm acknowledging the fact that people and their culture and their communities and society is not really coming forward as a major stakeholder in the future of how these how waters are being kind of thought of. So this leads to the survey, and in particular the survey for the community perceptions and values. So whilst looking at the archives has definitely done a lot to think about the past and how what's kind of what has led to, the survey is kind of thinking very much in the current. This research was done in 2019. So the survey had 102 respondents, and over half were local. So that's within one postcode of the site. As mentioned, the site was had a lot of sporting events, which meant that there was often a lot of people coming in from kind of various neighbourhoods or kind of various regions as well to participate in the sporting activities. The overall age was 45, with the youngest being 19 and the oldest being 76. Kind of ethics application meant that no one under 18 was allowed to participate in the survey. A couple of findings from the survey. So when asked the question, have you noticed change in the river since you first encountered it? The majority of people said yes. 73% of respondents had their first encounter with the river more than 15 years ago, and you would like to think that there would be some change since they first encountered it. I will note that quite purposely and quite explicitly that the wording of this question is not have you noticed a positive change or have you noticed a negative change, but rather just have you noticed a change. If I did word it as, as positive or negative change, that would be guiding the participants' response to think, maybe I have seen a negative change in the environment, in the river. What I wanted was just to notice whether or not there was a change or not. After that, then we could get into how they're thinking about the river, which started with the significance. So I wanted to know if this participant was actually cared about the river or not. Did they attribute any significance to the river? The majority of the people gave it a higher significance than they did a lower significance. So here, we can see very clearly the majority of people giving it a 5 or higher, with 1 being the lowest significance and 10 being the highest significance. Thinking about their engagement with the river and how they came to think about the river is something that I'm quite interested in as well. Looking at the environmental history and the archives that kind of were around the river, when asked the question, when asked to agree or disagree with a statement, there is enough acknowledgement of the historical events in and around the river, the majority of people said that they disagreed in some sense to that statement. And then we can connect that to this question, do you think historical issues are well promoted in the area? You can see that over 3/4 of the participants responded with no. And that's going to come clear in a moment as well. Regarding water in the river, what features would you like to see in the future? People wanted to see signage, predominantly. They wanted to see signage that promotes the ecology of the area, and they wanted to see signage that promotes the history of the area. Gardens, plants, water features, kind of, yes, people wanted to see them as well, but the more structural, the built, people wanted to see less of. So people wanted to see signs more so than they wanted to see something like a table or a gazebo. Who do you think manages the river? Majority of the respondents correctly identified as kind of local councils as being responsible for managing the river. Smatterings of other examples appeared as well. So whether that be Sydney Water, NPWS, RMS or EPA, they kind of were also options for people to think about. And you can think that people might have responded with the RMS if they, say for example, were a keen boater. They might connect more so with the RMS because they actually engage with the RMS at a more regular level than someone who doesn't boat. Or if you have received a fine or you've had some kind of engagement with the EPA, then you might consider that maybe they are the ones who are managing the river. But thinking about the council are the ones who are managing the river, that's who people identified the most with. In terms of the management of the river, the majority of the people said that they didn't feel involved in the decision-making process of the river, but they were actually kind of okay with that. So when asked to agree or disagree with the statement, the management of the river is satisfactory, we can see here clearly the majority of people did agree with that statement. So they didn't feel involved, but they also kind of were okay with that. So those are kinds of some of the findings that I did from the survey. If we move now on to the behavioural mapping section of the results. So the behavioural mapping was, as I said, me standing in a particular spot. So I would stand in a couple of different spots throughout the different sessions. But generally I like to stand in a spot that was quite central. So this in the central photo here we can see, but there's some other images around the park as well, which we can see, you know, there's a stormwater, there's a kind of a grate there with, and then we can see the dam as well. But the behavioural mapping ended up with results like this. So the results here showed me, you know, how many people were there. So I had the categories of 1 person, 2 people, or 3 people, and then I also would observe for how long they would spend. So for whether that be for less than 5 minutes or for more than 5 minutes. So we can see that, you know, if you're on your own, you're more inclined to go around the side of the kind of the dam area, which leads to the river, and that was quite often people would be either just doing that for, you know, for exercise walk, or they would be walking their dog, and they would be doing that predominantly on their own. If you were, you know, in a larger group, you're more likely to spend time around the tables. A lot of people were using the facilities, the toilet facilities there, as well as the playground was a point of reference as well. And spending time there. So, you know, there was people who were predominantly on their own were just basically just going straight past the, you know, the pond and going straight to the river. They were spending, you know, a minute in the space that I could observe there at most, you know. But, you know, if you're in a larger group, you're more inclined to sit at a table and spend, you know, 10, 15 minutes having a chat. Sometimes, you know, there were people there that were longer than I was there during the observations. So it's kind of thinking about how are people spending time in that space, and also what are they doing in those spaces as well. So those are kinds of some of the observations that I was making, and in particular thinking about how are they engaging with the stormwater infrastructure itself. So thinking about, you know, how many people and what are they doing in and around the pond area was something that I was concerned, that I had as a kind of a point of inquiry as well. The main findings for the whole research, if you think about the 3 methodologies together, in particular the surveys though. So the survey findings, most people feel that there could be more done in acknowledging and promoting the area's history. That most respondents had a long personal history with the river and felt that it was fundamentally significant. The signage is by and large the most desired feature to be developed in the area. Most people were aware that the river is managed by councils and feel that it is being managed well. However, many people still feel distanced from the decision-making processes of the river. Those are the kind of the core findings that I had from the surveys. And these kind of can be seen in various instances when I engaged with the space. The signage was really one of the areas that I feel could be an area of recommendation, if you will, for how to really improve it. Because if we look back, you know, one of the findings was that signage was actually wanted by people. If we look at the signs that exist now, it's not really hard to imagine why. These signs are really not telling anyone a lot, whether they be overgrown by vegetation, debris, very dated. They don't speak to a full sense of cultural identity. There's not really a lot going on with these signs in any real sense. That is what I would refer to as particularly useful or beneficial or good. Signs that do well are signs like this that pop up all around Australia, that kind of are very informative. They provide people with enough information if they wanted to spend time to read and really get an understanding of that place. They might give some context, some local personal histories, people who are very significant to that spot, cultural identity, pointers. They contextualize where the person is and what they might be looking at. So in the bottom left here, you know, what's this picture? There's a picture and it's showing the area in the past with what, you know, the person is looking at now, and that's a really great technique to try and get people to think about the history of a place, and that's a significant kind of finding that we had with the signage. So having people care about a place, and in particular a place that has water-sensitive urban design, was the kind of a catalyst for thinking about this new concept that we came up with, which is an extension of water-sensitive urban design to include the culture. So really having culture at its heart. So this way, cultural inclusive water urban design, or CWUD, as it's also acronymized here, involves 5 key areas. So the first is obviously the social, but it's also technical. So even just these 2 here, it's starting to understand WUSUD in a deeper way. That whereas WUSUD thinks about ameliorating technical issues around flooding or pollution, amongst others, immediately we're starting to think about the social. Add to that the cultural, and then we add, we're getting even more richness here. CWUD also fundamentally does, what WUSWUDs should do, which is to kind of work towards ecological health, but they also pay attention to the political in that sense as well. So here we get a full picture of how CWUD could be a holistic way for thinking about water urban design that fundamentally has culture and people at its heart. Looking at various instances of CWUD in practice, I take inspiration from Yerobinjin here, who are Indigenous-led organisation, working. So they've done a lot of work around the South Everleigh, the development at the Australian Technology Park there. And so here we can see examples of their cultural gardens that they've developed. And kind of as landscape architects and urban designers for various features, here we can see that they're not just putting in native plants, they're putting in native plants that speak for cultural reasons. And so there are stories and there is meaning behind the inclusion of particular features in the design of the place of that feature. And these also do have a function in a water-sensitive way as well. Other instances of CWUD that pop up being done really well down in Victoria. So here down in the Bendigo Creek Restoration case study, so this from the CRC Water Sensitive Cities, they've done a really great job at putting what I identify as CWUD in practice. So here they're responding to local cultural meanings, they're engaging with communities, and they are naturalizing the waterways as well. So they're doing all of these things kind of at the same time, which is really what CWUD is about, is doing them at the same time. It's not saying we're going to, do a cultural thing and an ecological thing, but we can do them at the same time, and that's an amazing thing. And that's what I fundamentally always thought that WUSWUDs could do. And so extending that and advancing it into CWUD is something that really excites me. The benefits of CWUD can be thought of in 3 kind of key areas. The first is the ecological, so that it does benefit the local ecosystems. It does prevent local pollution and pollution runoff, and it can also create habitats. So there were actually a lot of animals around Webb's Dam, and if we look about, if we think about what type of ecosystem is being created in the naturalization of these stormwater infrastructures, there's a lot going on there as well. They also, as mentioned, can also benefit local culture. So if we can create a sense of connection, if we can make people aware of the historical connections to a place, they're more likely to have a sense of belonging to that place as well. And that has benefits not just for its intrinsic value of helping people feel that they belong to a place, but there's actually also benefits from a technical point of view in getting people to feel that they belong, which comes to maintenance. So that if people feel that they have a sense of ownership or agency over the design and continued maintenance of a particular stormwater infrastructure or a particular CWUD, then there is a kind of an opportunity for councils to almost take a step back and let people take control of the continued maintenance of these stormwater infrastructures. So how might people think about local community cleanups, or how might people think about caring for and maintaining these CWUD features into the future is something that I think can be a real benefit of CWUD. And obviously, it kind of also addresses these issues of flood management as well from a technical point of view, the same way that warswords do as well. And all of these kinds of benefits that I've outlined here, they very neatly match with the Georges Riverkeepers kind of strategic plans that have been identified here. So I wanted to kind of connect the research that was done and how Seaward was kind of how it came to be with a very practical application for Georges Riverkeeper to take this on board and potentially apply it to various instances as well. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, there has been a journal article published out of this research that provides a lot more kind of detail and a lot more context for the research as well. And so if you're interested, this is the journal here. It is freely available. There's no paywalls for this one, which is great. So just if you type in or look up Culturally Inclusive Water Urban Design, A Critical History of Hydrosocial Infrastructures in Southern Sydney, then you'll be able to read that journal article there as well. My name is Taylor Coyne. These are my contact details. You can find more information about me and my research on my website. And I thank you so much for listening to my talk today. I'd really like to continue this conversation. I'm super keen to hear what your thoughts are on Seaward, and if you feel that you could apply it into wherever you are based, that would be really great to hear. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day.